Shalom, friends! Welcome to Orange Socks, a podcast celebrating Jewish creativity. I'm your host, Yitzchak Muli, inviting you to join me in exploring the soul of Jewish expression. Shalom, friends, and welcome to the Orange Socks podcast in a relatively clean studio. Not sure how much you can see. And I cleaned it up for you. I'm here with Yehoshua November. Yehoshua, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here. Thank you.
So we're fellow creatives, fellow Chabad creatives living in New Jersey, and yet we only seem to bump into each other in Brooklyn.
Right. Or decades apart.
Or decades apart, yes, and decades apart. Yeah, so I don't remember the timeline of when we've met and when we've crossed paths, and who's been on a creative journey for longer and who inspired who. But I know that you've always been this creative, I don't know if lurking in the background is a compliment or not. But how long have you been at this?
I've probably been writing poetry since I was in high school.
Okay. So way before me.
In college, yeah. So,
right.
So quite a long time.
Yeah, quite a long time.
But it's been a winding path.
We wouldn't expect anything less. Absolutely. And what's your timeline? I mean, your Judaism and your poetry. Which came first?
Well, I would say I grew up pretty traditionally.
Okay.
My family moved around a lot. I was born in Miami Beach, Florida, in 1979. My father was in residency there, and then we moved to Richmond, Virginia, Kansas City, Scranton, Minnesota, Pittsburgh, and then I went to college in Binghamton. I got married. My wife in Binghamton. I got married right after college. We got married. We moved to Pittsburgh to go to graduate school. Then I ended up learning in Morristown in Tiferes in Kollel for 2 years. Then I started teaching in college. I teach in Rutgers University and Ontario University, English, creative writing. So that's my basic background. And then after I was already married, my father joined the military and moved around many more times. Now he's in Israel with my mother. So I would say again, we probably grew up traditionally. Scranton was kind of like a satellite community of Lakewood. I went to the Hebrew Day School there. Probably I would also say that my family never quite fit neatly into any kind of Jewish identity box.
Okay.
We were traditional, but growing up, my father was a great fan of music, and he played Bob Dylan, Leonard Cohen, Sam Cooke. When we would go on road trips, that's was a formidable memory, hearing music on road trips. And my mother was a student of art history, so culture and music was always looming large in the background. At the same time, I would learn classic Jewish texts and study. But I would say probably at that time, up until maybe when I got married, I always kind of felt like Judaism is true and real and authentic, but it didn't really speak very deeply to me personally. And I think that's probably why I got interested in literature, because I felt like literature was more capable of speaking to the human experience. And it's
more than Judaism?
More than Judaism. I mean, more than studying Gemara.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, and that was really kind of like the bread and butter of what we were studying. Most of the time was devoted to Gemara. I mean, it's probably also my fault that I didn't see the humanity in the Jewish text. I didn't have it. It was tough, to compete with TV.
Yeah.
Between Gemara and the movies will always win.
Yes. Yeah.
So I probably didn't devote my fullest attention to Judaic studies, but I definitely did feel this kind of rift where, those things were a little boring,
Yeah.
and reading a novel spoke to me with more poignance and resonance. Um, so that was kind of like my feeling, and I think that's what really pushed, aside from having this strong cultural emphasis in my home and my family, that's probably the desire for something that spoke directly to me, that captured the human experience, is probably why I got into literature. And I should say that so there's four of us. I have a brother and two sisters, and my older brother is a poet, and then the next sister is also a poet. So 3 out of 4
Oh,
are a
wow.
poet.
Okay.
One sister is a social worker. So it was definitely arts were emphasized in our family. My father would pay us $10 per book that we would read
Okay.
growing up. I didn't take him
Right.
up on that as much as I should have, but that was a strong emphasis. And then after I got married, I enrolled in a creative writing for poetry MFA program, and I guess it was going through a lot of changes at that time, just being married, and I was living in Pittsburgh, and I got introduced to the Chabad community there, um, which sparked a real interest in studying Chassidus. And in Binghamton, my wife and I were very close with the Slonims there, the Shluchim in Binghamton, uh, Chabad of Binghamton, Binghamton University. So I think that was like a entry point into Chabad and Chassidus.
Your religious Jewish journey seems like it ebbed and flowed. There weren't some like
Yeah,
wasn't some big
right.
epiphany
No,
moment. It
because
was
I
just
was
a
pretty traditional.
right.
I studied in Israel, also in yeshiva. It was called yeshiva Kotel
Okay, so
for a
you were
year.
pretty
So yeah,
right.
I grew up pretty much,
I mean, some
more or
would call
less a
that
modern
yeah,
Orthodox
some would
path.
call that modern Orthodox.
Path. But there was other influences in the background. Definitely some Chabad influence. My cousins are Chabad. Um, but I think the real turning point was probably in graduate school. I felt a little bit out of place, being a much more traditional person, just having gotten married, and the culture in graduate school was like, a lot of like literary partying. It's almost seemed like it was more important to live a literary life than it was to actually be writing.
Right. Sure.
So
Sure.
whatever, I just was kind of at odds with the culture, and I had some run-ins with the professors about conflicts about Israel. Back then, even, it was really a hot button issue.
Sure.
And I ended up feeling kind of alienated from some of the professors. Um, and at the same time, I was just kind of getting immersed in learning Chassidus in Pittsburgh. So kind of like really put me at a crossroads. And eventually I decided, once I finished graduate school, I really want to go and have a kind of full immersion experience in learning in the Chabad yeshiva. And I moved to Morristown. We already had a daughter who was just born, and I lived there for 2 years, and then we lived there for like 6 more years before moving to Teaneck.
And I mean, your parents definitely, I'm sure, proud of having 3 poets in the family.
They also kind of wonder what went wrong.
But from a financial standpoint or a future, you thought like this was
Yeah,
how you're going to make your future. I mean,
uh,
how did you?
yeah. I think that when somebody goes into poetry, they're not really thinking about from a financial standpoint.
Right.
That's probably why in religious Jewish homes, the arts are not encouraged, at least as a profession, maybe as a
Right.
kind of
Right.
a side hobby,
Right.
but not as the central emphasis.
Right.
So I would say that, for better or worse, I just wasn't really thinking about it.
Fair enough.
I didn't really know where I would end up in my life. I didn't know what kind of family I
Right.
would have. I really didn't know what kind of life I would necessarily be living. And when I was in college, I was writing poetry, and I gained the support of a lot of my writing professors. Some of them even came to like Brooklyn for my wedding. They came down from Binghamton. So I had strong support from writing mentors, and that helped me take myself seriously as a writer and believe in myself as a writer. and therefore go on to pursue a graduate degree in creative writing, MFA. So I wasn't thinking, that practical. I knew, I got married right after college, but I just didn't really think about the you know the necessity to earn a living and what that would entail and how much money I would need. Again, that's thank God, things worked out, and I was able to get teaching positions
Right.
and provide. Um, I think that really actually is, you know, almost miraculous because I wasn't really planning.
Right.
I
Right.
wasn't planning. I mean, I did think, oh, maybe I should teach in a public school, and that's like a practical job, and you'll have benefits, and you'll have security. But in the end, I didn't really want to do that, and I didn't think I could actually be that good at classroom management for younger people.
Right. Right. Yeah.
So I didn't end up doing that. And I mean, it wasn't practical either once I finished my MFA to go to learn in yeshiva for a couple years.
Right.
So, to be artistically or spiritually ambitious, I think you do have to de-emphasize material wealth to some
Yeah.
degree.
No, to some degree for sure, but just being able to pay some basic bills and putting some food on the table is also a factor.
Yeah.
So of all, I mean, were you into any other form of creativity, or was it just writing, and within writing, just
writing.
poetry?
I drew a little bit, and I wrote some short stories, but mainly poetry. I like the way that everything unfolds very quickly in a poem,
Right.
and how so much can be compressed within a poem. I mean, you could read a memoir about somebody and their family, and that could span several hundred pages. But from reading a single poem, sometimes you do get a very condensed, pressurized sense of the person's larger life. So I admire that. Maybe it's also an issue of patience. At least when I was starting out, I couldn't really imagine sitting and writing a whole novel.
Right.
But you could take it poem by poem.
Right. And you can take it poem by poem.
I mean, some people talk about when you write a book of poetry, what's your book project? Do you have a larger book project? But I never really thought of it that way. I just kind of thought it's hard enough to write one good poem.
Right.
Let me write one good poem, and then another and another, and put them together and see which ones kind of complement each other and work well as a larger collection. And my poetry, I think, is largely autobiographical about my own life,
Right.
And also trying to incorporate Chassidus. So therefore, there's a kind of common ground across the poems. So they seem to work well together.
And how I'm fascinated by poetry, and I know very little. And as I said, I'm an auditory processing person, so it's very hard for me to read in general, and it's really hard for me to read poetry because unless, like, when you're hearing it, you hear the intonation, you hear the poet presenting their work. And I feel like of all the creativity within the Jewish sphere, the Orthodox Jewish sphere, if we'll call it that, there's talk of that we're in a renaissance of from Jewish art or Jewish art in general, and there's a lot of painters, there's a lot of almost there's a lot of music. Jewish music is years ahead of us. There's a lot of painters, but poetry seems to be. Even there's writers, but poetry seems to be. What on earth is going on? Kids are playing. What is it called? And it's showing up on my phone.
Do you have to edit? Do you edit your things a lot or not?
I'll edit.
No worries.
They're trying to play on Spotify, and it's showing up on my phone.
The wonders of technology.
Yeah, tell me about it. Let me try to phrase that question again.
Okay, it's a recording.
Yeah, it's still recording. It's just going strong. Poetry, of all things. I mean, I'm fascinated by it. I don't know much. Someone gave me a book of poetry to read, and I didn't make it very far.
I actually myself can't make it through most books of poetry.
Really.
Well, I think that it's really hard to write a good poem. So even in a poetry book, you might encounter only several really strong poems. I think
Right.
what marks a really good poet is that they're able to write such a way that all their poems are at least interesting
Right.
and enjoyable to read.
Right.
But it is hard to write a good. I remember in graduate school, one of my professors saying, "Oh, in a poetry book, maybe there will be 7 good poems out
Wow.
of like around the minimum page count for a poetry book is like 48 pages,
Right.
so 7 good poems. So it's just hard.
Right.
So you're not alone in not being able to get through the
Right.
poetry book. But I think that one reason why people don't like poetry, at least contemporary poetry, is because they probably haven't been exposed to that much of it.
Right.
And,
Yes. Exactly.
and when they think about poetry, they probably are imagining poetry written at least over 100 years ago,
Right.
that rhymes and that is presented as if it's a kind of a riddle that you have to decode.
Right.
And that makes sense that a person would not be interested in reading that. I mean, unless you're, interested in literature for its own sake. I always tell my students that imagine, if you sometimes in, shows they have like interview the man on the street,
Right.
and imagine if you went out onto the street and you asked, 10 people, do they like poetry?
Right.
How many of them would say no? Probably 9 out of 10, maybe
Right.
10 out
10
of
out of
10.
10.
And if you ask them why, they would say because I don't understand it.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and that makes sense. I mean, who would want to come home after a long day of work, exhausted, and open up a big collection of poetry, a tome of poetry that they don't understand? But I think that that's actually somewhat tragic because contemporary poetry, a lot of it at least, is exceedingly accessible.
Right.
And it's narrative, it's almost like a story.
Right.
And so, but people don't know that. They haven't been exposed to contemporary poetry, so they feel that it's kind of opaque, and they just can't, they can't, they can't penetrate it.
Right.
But it's not really the case. I think if people read contemporary poetry, they might actually come away asking, why does this qualify as poetry? It doesn't rhyme, it doesn't use meter, it's a story, just
Right.
very, very condensed and short. And so I think when people are exposed to that kind of poetry, they'll actually be pleasantly surprised and find that they might even like it. Like in teaching
Right.
intro to creative writing, that is a kind of one of the goals, is to demystify poetry, or to disabuse people of the myth that they can't understand it. And what often ends up happening is they realize that they like it. And especially if you give students assignments where they're writing about their own life and their own memories and their own stories,
Right.
then of course everybody feels closest to themselves and
Yeah.
their own emotions and
Right.
stories, and they end up realizing that it's a vehicle for expressing some important truths or memories, and in a very poignant and compressed way.
Yeah.
So I would say to those who think they don't like poetry, you probably haven't read very much contemporary narrative poetry.
Right. Well, there's poetry, the written form, which I suppose is pure poetry.
Right,
But
right.
then there's the performance of the
Performance, right,
poetry,
right,
which, generally only by the poet themselves. You can't
right,
really,
right,
I
right,
don't know if you can
right,
or cannot perform someone else's poems, but
right,
when it's coming from the author, that
right,
opens it up greatly. That
right,
changes
right.
the whole experience. That almost,
Yeah,
it's more fuller,
right. It is an
when,
oral art. That's what it was originally, meant to be in a way. I mean, it might not come as a surprise to you, but I'm not a great performance poet. I mean, I, I I do enjoy reading my poetry
right.
to an audience, and I think that there's a special kind of dynamic when you hear the author read their work. It's a special experience, and it definitely is enriching. And when a poet reads their own work, you'll hear the point, what they emphasize, how they read it
exactly.
will be very different than the experience than reading it on the page, even if it's not what you might call performance, where they're using a lot of like body language and changing their tone and sing, partially singing. Even just a person sitting and reading their poem in their ordinary voice is a unique experience, I think.
Yeah, well, it's a window into the poet and the poem.
Right.
Yeah, I suppose the extreme of that is rap.
Right.
Performance, rap, not just
Right. I have a friend, actually. His name's David Kaplan. He's also a poet, a Lubavitch poet, and he actually wrote an interesting study uh, analyzing contemporary R&B artists, rap artists, and ultimately he published a book about it. The book is ultimately makes the argument that contemporary R&B artists are more skilled at poetic craft, like rhyme and meter, than are contemporary poets, because contemporary poets are not writing in rhyme or meter generally, most of them. So really, although you might think of R&B artists as less sophisticated, maybe because of the vulgar language and subject matter at times, but they are actually very skilled at classical poetic technique.
Classical, right. So, changing gears a little bit, as a chassid, I suppose it goes without saying, but that our role, implicit our role as creatives and chassidim, is to want to share our love for Judaism through our medium as best as we can.
Right.
At the same time, you're saying that poetry is so. Again, I don't have a good word for this.
Accessible.
Yeah, I was just trying to come up with a more flowery word, but it's not that accessible.
Right.
How do you balance those two?
Well, I think it's an interesting question. First of all, I would say that you can't. I can't approach a poem in such a way that I'm going to use it as a vehicle, or consciously use it as a vehicle to try to teach somebody something about Judaism or Chassidus, because then it becomes more across as a sermon, or pedantic, like preachy, and less human. Then and then that kind of, again, is really, nobody likes to be preached to.
Sure.
Nobody likes to be talked down to. So you can't really use a poem as a soapbox, especially a poem. A poem is, I think, a special space of truth. So you could tell a truth about Chassidus or Judaism, but you can't, in my experience, try to frame it like, or approach it like you're lecturing. So how can you talk about Judaism and communicate what you think is beautiful about Judaism? I think you have to do it in such a way that you're just talking about your experience, the experience that you have had, and how you've processed it as a Jew, as a human being, as a Jew, and write about that. The only times where I've seen that you could actually, maybe you could call it successfully, communicate an idea in Chassidus in a poem and use it that way, is if you just find the idea really interesting and beautiful, and you're just writing about like a, maybe like a nerd might write about a comic book or something like that. You like it, you think it's beautiful and interesting, and you write out of that excitement. But again, that's not preaching. It's just your own personal excitement. So I'm very wary of using poetry as a medium to consciously communicate Chassidus. I think if a person is learning Chassidus, and Chassidus is an important part of their life, and then they sit down to write about their life in a poem, then that will spill out into the page naturally. Now, again, there's different ways to look at a poem. If some people say, no, I just want to communicate Chassidus in a poem, and that's what the poetry is, just a vehicle. It's just a medium for that. That's also fine, but I would say you probably wouldn't gain an audience in the secular contemporary the secular contemporary poetry world.
Right. No, my question wasn't how do you communicate Chassidus as in
Right,
like a specific concept and taking the
right,
concept and now,
right,
all right, how do I use poetry to communicate that?
right,
But it's that our role as creatives
right,
is to share our perspective of
right,
Judaism, our
right,
love
right,
for Judaism,
right,
our
right,
appreciation for Judaism,
right.
the whatever it is, whatever relationship we're having with Judaism, to communicate that with others. Like a lady once asked me, I was displaying my painting somewhere, and she said, "Are you only allowed to paint religious, Jewish subject matter?" I said, "No, I can paint whatever I want. Just today, I
Right.
happen to be passionate about my Judaism. Today, I'm painting my Judaism. We'll see what happens tomorrow." So
Right,
it's
right.
more about that. It's yeah,
Yeah.
we paint what we're passionate about. We write what we're passionate
Right,
about.
right,
It's
right,
not a
right,
there's no musts at all.
right,
At least
right,
that's what I find in
right,
my work.
right. No, and I think if you do feel that there is an obligation, then it will come out unnaturally.
Right, right,
So that's, yeah, something to think about. And again, if you're writing in the larger secular poetry world, you already have a kind of strike against you because the poetry world, the contemporary poetry world, is largely secular,
right,
and not just secular, but probably cynical about people of faith,
right,
assuming that people of faith think they have all the answers and that their life is easy or simple. So you're definitely at a disadvantage already in being a person of faith in the literary world, but especially so if you try to preach to people.
sure, yeah, yeah, yeah,
You would not, you wouldn't really be well received at all.
right,
But the thing about that is, the irony maybe is that I don't think that Chassidus or Judaism would expect us to write in an unnatural way either. I think
oh,
that
absolutely, I agree, sure,
one interesting thing I found about contemporary poetry is that it often focuses um, on very um, ordinary and mundane elements of daily life. It's almost surprising because it's something that I wonder about a lot. It makes sense that secular poets don't write about God or religion or religious settings, but it is puzzling to me that they turn to shine a very intense light on the ordinary and almost insist that there's wondrousness in the ordinary. In fact, if you look at most the blurbs on open up a poetry book, look at the back of any contemporary poetry book, and it will praise the author for finding wonder in the daily life.
right,
That seems to be one of the primary ambitions of contemporary poetry and poets, show that there's wonderment in the ordinary, which I think for me really is very similar to what Chassidic theology is also suggesting, in that that the point is, at least in the Midrash and Chassidus, to make the world a dir b'tachtonim, to make the world a home for God, means to take the physical, means to take the ordinary and to spiritualize it, or to make your life and your personal life into Vasili Migdash, make your personal life into a Mishkan. I would say that most secular poets are doing that in at least a secular kind of iteration, where
right,
they're like insistent that every small passing moment, every encounter is wondrous and worthy of our attention, more so even than these larger moments. Again, it's not surprising they're not talking about religion, but it is surprising that they shine a spotlight on mundane elements of life as opposed to these larger moments.
right,
So I almost sometimes I argue that maybe they even like kind of sense that there is the most greatest profundity is in the ordinary,
right,
which really is the argument of Chassidus. I think if you look at the Shar Yichud V'Emunah in the second parak, um, the Alter Rebbe says that really existence itself, the most ordinary element of existence is more wondrous than Kriyas Yamsuf. It's more wondrous than the splitting of the sea.
Right.
That's because, you know, it's being brought back into being from absolute nothingness each moment, whereas the splitting of the sea is kind of taking two existing elements and you know, the wind, having the wind act on the sea. That's not as remarkable as bringing the world into being from absolute nothingness. That is really something that only God in his essence is capable of. So that suggests that, you know, the mere existence of a stone, the mere existence of, you know, a table, a coffee cup is a greater miracle than splitting the sea. And I think that contemporary poetry would agree with that. And most of contemporary poetry is kind of making that argument and is influenced by that way of thinking. So in a certain sense, it's a pleasant surprise or to see the dovetailing or the overlap between contemporary poetry and Chassidus. I mean, people, you know, one of the big questions, common questions they get is, what is it like to be a poet, you know, a frum poet,
Right.
a frum person who's living a traditional life, and also be a poet, a contemporary poet. But, you know, in a way, there's a lot of common ground you know, in the two ways of thinking, in the 2 points of emphasis, especially this emphasis on the ordinary.
Right.
So you know, surprisingly, there's more common ground than a person might imagine.
Right. So how do you go about writing a poem? I mean, you said earlier, but it's you know, to sit and to write a whole novel, you know, you can't imagine doing that. And you take one poem at a time. Do you sit down? Do you have scheduled times that you sit down to write and then ideas come? Do you have ideas, you write them down? What's your general creative process?
I tell my students that, you know, the hardest thing is just to sit down and write.
Right.
To just get yourself to do it. And I even suggest, you know, seeing from other, you know, artists, to just like put a timer on your phone, like 5 minutes. I'm going to write for 5 minutes. If I can sit down and do for 5 minutes, that's not this impossible mountain that I need to scale. And I could do that. So, I mean, I wish I would take that advice myself, but I definitely tell my students, some of the students are like, one class of teachers, like, their students are writing a creative thesis, so they're writing like a part of a novel or part of poetry, because it's a long project,
right?
And that's intimidating because it just seems so vast,
right? But
to try to tell it to break it up into pieces. Now, for myself, I mean, I really wish I would be more disciplined. I think that's really an area where I'm sorely lacking. Just managing to make time for writing. During the year, I'm doing a lot of teaching. And, you know, one of the drawbacks of that is that, you know, you could spend as much or as little time as you like on preparing and looking at your students' work.
Right.
But I'm very slow and kind of like a perfectionist, so it ends up taking a lot of my time. The positive is that you're always in the world of writing and literature,
right,
as opposed to something else that might be distracting. But so I find in the summer when I'm teaching less is really the time that I have to produce. Also, I think the thing that's most helpful is simply like when I have like a deadline, or when somebody asks me to produce something.
Right.
I otherwise could find all kinds of distractions.
Yeah.
There's no shortage of distractions, and
familiar.
Some of them are very legitimate distractions.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, I'm you know, I have to comment on my student's poem.
Right. Right.
I can't, you know, or I have to learn, or you know, I have to take out the garbage. So there's so many. So I think you have to kind of find ways to hold yourself accountable. Some people are, you know, in writing groups. That's good. I rationalize not being in a writing group also. So that's something that I struggle with. It really is one of the greatest points of struggle for me, just making time. But I try to, you know, do it in the summer. As far as writing the poems themselves, sometimes I get very anxious, or in the past I got very anxious. I said to myself, like, okay, I have like 2 or 3 months down the summer, and this is like mainly my time to write. So I really gotta, I must do it. and I really have to produce some good work.
Right.
And that is probably the worst thing that you could do for yourself as an artist, because you're too uptight and you're
Right.
too constricted, and that, you're not going to be able to be creative when you're trying too hard.
Yeah.
So, over time, I realized that, just spend the time writing in the summer that I have, but don't have high expectations. Just put the time in, and if it works, it works. If not, it's not. That's not really in my control.
Right.
In fact, I think with my own students, a lot of times in the beginning of each class, I'll give them a prompt, just that they do on the spot, and because they're doing it on the spot, there's not too much pressure, and sometimes I'll even make the prompt a little bit weird or bizarre or strange, so that they can't take themselves too seriously. Like one prompt I used to write like a poem that starts, in the dream, my father reprimanded me for wearing earmuffs indoors.
Right.
Or write a story, each morning, Buford awoke at dawn to unlock the galoshes factory. Because the nature of the prompt is kind of bizarre,
Right.
and therefore it really
Allows them.
allows them to not take themselves too seriously, and that's really where the surprise can occur. I mean, I think there is a big difference between writing an essay, let's say, and writing a poem. When you write an essay, you have an argument, and you're trying to get that argument across, and you're working with the analytical part of your brain, and you're trying to be organized. Even there, it's probably good to just kind of let yourself free write a little bit and then revise. But much more so in a poem, you're trying to get to this space of creativity and surprise. And the only way to get there is to kind of open up all the doors and not limit yourself and have a censor over your shoulder saying, this better be good.
Yeah.
Because that's the sure ticket to writing something that's not good.
Yeah. That's a lot of pressure.
Right. So that's something important, to maybe do prompts to read, and to just take the pressure off yourself, and let yourself write. You never know what's going to be good and what's not. And often, are some of the poems that received the best reception and the most popular were poems that I started to write a poem, and it was very long, and then maybe in the middle or the end there was like 8 good lines that was a poem unto itself. But I needed to write the bad lines first to get to the good lines. So you never know what part is going to be good, where it's going to be good. It's also true that you really lack objectivity as a writer. So, for example, in the act of writing, especially if you're writing about something that's important to you or emotionally sensitive, as you're writing it, you might be reliving that experience.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll feel a heightened sense of emotions, and you'll think to yourself, this is really good.
Right.
Because you're in the act of experiencing the emotions associated with the original experience that you're writing about, and you tell yourself, this is actually probably one of my best pieces.
Right.
And then you look at it a week later and it's one of your worst pieces. And then conversely, sometimes you sit down and write and you say, this is just, it's okay, it's fine, it's ordinary. And then it ends up being really kind of interesting or thought-provoking in one of your more popular pieces. So that's also something to that you contend with in the writing process. So you got to just kind of let yourself write.
Right.
Don't put pressure on yourself. It's good to read before. I find it's good to read before you write. And
what kind of reading?
Read poems. It's also interesting. I think that probably my best poetry comes out of a feeling of being inspired, like reaching a kind of state of truth and egolessness. And when I feel like I'm not being egotistical, being humbled by life and inspired by a beautiful teaching, that's a good time to write. Or more commonly for me, when I feel like life is overwhelming and I'm being crushed by life, like a Cassis Lama, or like when the olive is squeezed, then the oil comes out. I do think of that, for whatever reason, maybe it's just my personality, that I do tend to write about difficulties in sad top subject matter, and that comes perhaps the easiest for me, the most fluidly. but that too, I think, I think that that's also really consistent with the idea of dir b'tachtonim, the idea that God created the world because He wants a home in the lowest realm, and the most typical way to understand that is He wants us to use the physical world to elevate it through using it for Torah and mitzvos, but it also means, I think, that you in your life you have your relative lower realm moments in an individual's own life. You have the relative lower realm moments, and to try to surmount those experiences, get through them with faith and dignity, is to make a dir b'tachtonim. And then in poetry, to write about that maybe is to document the work of dir b'tachtonim, to make this world a home for God. So I mean, it's a sensitive topic, I think, as a religious artist, what is appropriate to include in your work,
Right.
Especially if it's about your family. Every poet, writer, especially poets, have to contend with that question: how much of my own life and my family life
Personal life.
is it personal life? Is it appropriate to include in a poem? But especially a religious artist, in being that religious culture is a lot more private.
Right.
That's definitely a big question. My second book was really very personal, and it had a lot to do with the struggles of raising a family. And there was actually a question if I should publish that book.
So it wasn't a question about writing it. You needed to write it.
I wrote it because I wrote the poems. I couldn't write any other poems.
Right.
Like I said, I struggled sitting down to write. And so a lot of times when I'm able to write is when life is crushing me, then I could sit down and write. And I have to, I'm expressing myself in that way. So I wrote those poems. I couldn't have written any other poems. Then the question was, should I publish them?
Right.
I mean, honestly, again, I didn't have. If I didn't publish those poems, I wouldn't have any other poems to publish. But that doesn't mean that you should publish them for that reason.
How often must I publish?
I mean, you want to stay relevant, so but so that was a question. Is it okay to publish this? And I asked a spiritual mentor, and they said, this is really a question that you have to ask your wife.
Because she features.
She's there. It's about our children.
It's about life.
Right. And she's a very supportive, open-minded person, and she, gave me the go-ahead. So I think I'm fortunate to have a wife who's supportive in that way. But one of the things that ran through my mind when I was thinking about it, is it okay to publish this? Should I publish it? Is this idea that that maybe that's what dir b'tachtonim is. Dir b'tachtonim means you have hardships in your life, and you write about them, and through writing about them and coming through the situations, then you are making dir b'tachtonim. You're finding God or bringing God into the lowest realm. The Alter Rebbe uses the lashon tachton she'ein tachton l'matmena, the lowest realm relative to which there's nothing low. I mean, so that could mean that he's talking about this world of Asiya, the lowest physical world, relative to Atzilus, the highest spiritual world. But it could also mean that within this world itself, there are higher moments and lower moments, and it's dafka, the lowest moments, precisely the lowest moments, that really are the ultimate fulfillment of the dir b'tachtonim, if you can elevate them. And I guess I figured, yes, I'm going through these struggles, but obviously the life that I'm continuing to live is a commentary on where I am at, and that should speak for itself. And in that way, first of all, maybe it's helpful for other people who are struggling, and maybe that's what a dir b'tachtonim means. And as an artist, that's what it means to chronicle the dir b'tachtonim in your poetry, in your art. So in that way, I felt like, it's definitely provocative, and maybe some people would question it, but I felt like that was the right thing to do.
Some people on which side of the aisle? from the literary crowd?
Not the literary crowd, because in the literary crowd it's mild by comparison.
Right.
But in the Jewish religious world,
Right.
I mean, the fortunate thing is that those people who might be critical of it are probably not reading poetry anyway.
Yeah, that's like who are you even worried about? I mean,
most people that are going to end up reading it anyway are going to be probably a little bit more creative and a little bit more open to the arts, that they wouldn't have that coming with that kind of bias.
Two questions is that number one, you said a more successful poem. So what defines
what's a more successful
poem? What makes a successful poem successful? Okay,
so that there's many ways to gauge that. One way, I guess, what I was speaking about earlier is just kind of the reception that it gets. Like some poems, you write and you either, let's say, you put in a book and nobody mentions it, and it was never published in a journal, and then some poems like get on podcasts and like sometimes large secular venues even that could reach a lot of people. So that I would say that's a commercially successful
when
poem.
You're invited to read or to share that.
Or someone sees it somehow and then they
reference
feature
it. They talk about
one
it.
poem I had was featured on a poetry podcast, like on the On Being channel. So that was like there's a kind of Poetry Unbound, it's called, the podcast. That's like a pretty widely circulated podcast, and the podcast host happened to see the poem and he read it and analyzed it. So that's, like, I would say that's a commercial success for a poem.
Right.
It's just getting more notoriety, getting people are getting more exposure. Then again, there's poems that are not read at all. They're in a book and I even forgot that I wrote it. but then another way I guess you could measure a poem's success is how satisfied you are as a writer with the poem.
Right. And then that's in the short term, and then in the longer term.
In the long term, right. So that's another gauge. Usually, in my mind, I feel more satisfied with the poems that are like more emotionally impactful. But again, that's not always what an audience necessarily would find as a favorite.
Right. So there's my other question. Who is your audience? or there's two sides to that. Who is the inevitable audience?
I guess really.
And then who is your target audience?
I mean,
do you write to anyone?
My main readers are like my parents. No, just
and your cat.
I can't say that I have a vast audience, but yeah, that's a good question. When you're writing a poem, who is your audience? I guess I'm trying when I have a friend who said, David Kaplan, the same one that wrote the book about rap and R&B music. He said, write the poem that you would want to read, which is very good advice.
Right.
I guess I feel like sometimes when I'm writing, I'm getting to like a space of authenticity. And it usually is true coincidingly that when I get there, the writing is better, objectively. So I'm kind of trying to get to that space. Maybe it's a little bit like talking to myself, and somebody else who I feel is like unpretentious and honest, and a seeker, and not cynical. So cynical they wouldn't be open to spirituality,
right?
But also, somebody who's a thinking person, who's a curious person. I'm trying to kind of get to that audience. I mean, some people are just going to be closed to my poetry just because it's coming from me. So that's obviously not who I'm thinking about. It's hard to say. There's also different poems, and those are maybe you think about different audience for those two.
Have you been asked to share any poems at a Farbrengen? Has that ever come up?
Yeah. It's interesting. I was going to say that sometimes I think that that space of authenticity that you could try to get to in writing a poem is similar to the space of a good Farbrengen,
right?
Where nobody's like lecturing, or it's not just the platitudes. It's not just going through the motions, but somebody's really kind of saying something, and they're open, their heart is open, and they're saying something authentic and meaningful and vulnerable. So I sometimes draw a parallel between that and the poem
Good for
that's
right.
getting to that space also.
Nice.
Yeah.
Amazing. Would you like to share some?
A poem?
Yeah.
Okay,
Do
sure.
you got anything on hand?
Yeah. Okay, so this poem, I would say, probably poem that you know is when people know my poetry, they probably know this poem the most, and it's called "Bal Tshuvas at the Mikveh," um, and it was actually written, based on experiences being in Morristown,
Yeah. Yeah.
there's the Bal Tshuva Yeshiva, the Tiferes, and I was there in the yeshiva, and there's people from all kinds of backgrounds, and there's everyone. A lot of the men are going to the mikveh before shachris, before davening. So then there's some people there who have colorful pasts and they have tattoos. So it's a kind of about the experience of seeing a person with a tattoo at the mikveh. Second. So okay, it's called Bal Tshuvas at the mikveh. Sometimes you see them in the dressing area of the ritual bath. Young bearded men unbuttoning their white shirts, slipping out of their black trousers until, standing entirely naked, they are betrayed by the tattoos of their past life. A ring of fire climbing up a leg, an eagle whose feathery wingspan spreads the width of the chest, or worse, the scripted name of a woman other than one's wife. Then, holding only a towel, they begin once more the walk past the others in the dressing room. The rabbi they will soon sit before in Talmud class, men with the last names of the first Chassidic families, almost everyone devout since birth. And with each step, they curse the poverty that keeps the dark ink etched in their skin, until finally they descend the stairs of the purifying water, and beneath the translucent liquid appear once again like the next man, who in all his days has probably never made a sacrifice as endearing to God.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Does
go ahead.
go no? I mean, can we break it down a little bit? Can we
Yeah.
analyze
Sure,
that?
sure.
I mean, does a poem have to? Does the last line have to be a punch? Does it have to
Okay.
to
Yeah,
crescendo?
that's a good question. So I mean, sometimes it is,
Right.
but I tell my students actually the last line of the poem does not have to be like a punchline to a joke, like the best moment.
Right.
Sometimes the best moments in a poem have already come,
Right.
and you're trying to kind of just sneak out of the poem. So then a good idea is just to maybe end the poem with an image, like a
Right.
simple image, and then kind of drift off the page.
Right.
And you did your work, and you're just trying to kind of find a way out of the poem. So that sometimes is the case. I mean, that poem, I think, you asked me like what inspires a poem by the writing process. I think that poem is probably one of my more popular poems. It was probably one of the ones that I found the easiest to write, and that's because it started with this image, this very striking image of this person with a tattoo
that you've experienced more than once. It's a
you're right,
continual.
yeah. And when I saw it, I knew that is the stuff of poetry,
Right.
Because it's the stuff of real life, really, in vulnerability,
and it's these strong contrasts.
Right, a strong contrast. So I felt like that was poetic material. I didn't write the poem right away, but it definitely branded itself in my imagination. And then when I sat down to write it, it was a easier poem to write. So I think amongst my poems, those poems that start with a kind of provocative image or a memorable image, a resonant image, then when you sit down to write the poem, it comes out pretty quickly, which is interesting. You're not really you don't have to work to some poems. I call them more like manufactured poems, where you really had to revise them a lot and work in them a lot.
Right.
There too, it's good to just put it aside. If you get stuck in a poem and you see you're not getting anywhere, and then you're tinkering with it for like moving a comma, every half hour, then probably good to just put it aside,
Right.
give yourself a week,
Right.
and then come back to it. And then a lot of the things that you were struggling with become very clear, and you're much easier to kind of iron out. Yeah.
I'm thinking of that, how the creative process, according to Chassidus, how that plays out in that in a manufactured poem, as you say, versus something that just
Yeah,
Chachma was been on. So
right. Yeah,
right.
that's true. That's true. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's also, I guess, the question of, you're asking about audience. That's also really a question of tzimtzum, right?
Right.
That
Right.
what can the audience handle, right?
Yeah.
What can I give them that they'll
Right.
be able to take, that won't overwhelm them, and that's
That'll be
also,
relevant to them.
that's
That'll
also,
be meaningful to
you're
them.
right. And when you do end up writing about Chassidus, let's say to an uninitiated audience, then you really have to like think about like, how much can I put in here?
Right.
What can I put it? I could read a poem that is like more of an example of a Chassidic teaching incorporated in the poem.
Okay.
Well, let me read this poem. It's another. I might as well read another mikveh poem, right?
Let's do it.
So this poem is I don't know who will be familiar with Roy Orbison. Roy Orbison's a famous pop singer, secular singer. His famous song is called "Pretty Woman," one of the famous songs. But he was an artist like in the 60s and 70s, and he was famous because he would wear these like kind of like sunglasses, and he wouldn't dance on stage. He was like very kind of like inhibited or shy almost. So this poem I wrote, it's called "Hearing Roy Orbison in a Mikveh in Salem, Massachusetts."
Okay.
Which there's so many poems by that title, but this is just my
Yes.
I wrote the poem. It's basically just almost exactly kind of the way that it happened. But I was in Salem for a panel, a poetry panel on I think it was on prayer or something like that, and I was it was just weird to be in Salem, Massachusetts, and I was using the mikveh in the hotel.
Okay.
So it was a kind of an interesting convergence of many different facets of my life. And so what I did is, in the poem, I also took some lines from one of Roy Orbison's songs, and also some ideas from Chassidus, and kind of like went back and forth, weaving them back and forth. So it starts. The poem's called "Hearing Roy Orbison in a Mikveh in Salem, Massachusetts," and the line that begins is, "In dreams I walk with you," which is like a line from Orbison's poem. "In dreams I walk with you," Roy Orbison crooned from the speakers above the indoor pool at the Holiday Inn, steam rising as I resurfaced from beneath the chlorine waters of the makeshift mikveh. If slightly rearranged, the letters in the word tevilah, ritual immersion in a body of water, spell habital, the self's dissolution in the face of the divine. He was quiet, self-effacing, Orbison's biographers noted. Bathed in spotlight, he hid behind Wayfarer sunglasses and never danced on stage. To submerge beneath the water, the mystics add, is to return to the divine womb, the way the soul returns to the heavens each night as the body dozes. Claudette, Orbison's first wife, whom he divorced after her infidelities with the contractor who'd built the couple's Hendersonville home, and whom he remarried a year later, died in the singer's arms shortly after her motorcycle collided with a truck pulling on to Southwater Avenue. It was 6 a.m. I had the mikveh to myself. I heard desperation in the operatic voice that hailed from Vernon, Texas. I was in Salem for a panel on 21st century devotional poetry. Like the soul climbing while the body reposes, Orbison's voice rose higher than the sopranos. In dreams, I talk with you. The lyrics came to me as I slept, Orbison claimed. Words I wrote down upon waking. Our panel asked what it meant for a contemporary poet to speak to our Father in heaven in this millennium. Mostly, we do not know. 2 of Orbison's sons, 6 and 11, died when the Hendersonville home went up in flames. Orbison's second wife, Barbara, passed away on the 23rd anniversary of the singer's death. Once, 3,000 years ago, Moses asked God, who could have made the world any way he wanted, why he'd created suffering. Moses, whose name means one drawn from the water, was the only prophet to speak with God face to face, that is, in a waking state. But he heard only staticky silence, oceanic, wave-like, the crackling of a turntable following a song's final note. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
So,
No crescendo right
no
there.
crescendo. Yeah. I thought that poem was interesting to write. It just because it kind of was a convergence of so many different parts of my life. I mean, I'm growing up, my father played Roy Orbison, and here I was, like in Salem, Massachusetts, a weird place to be,
Right.
for a poetry panel. But I'm also using the mikveh, the Holiday Inn pool as a mikveh. So it was like almost so strange and surreal that only God could have come up with such a strange, combination of dynamics.
But at the same time, you had to be listening. You had to be conscious of it to see it.
Right.
Otherwise,
I found...
how many people notice, the music going on in the changing room, in the elevator, in the whatever.
Right.
It just gets drowned out.
Right. No, I do think people that become artists, a lot of times do have a heightened sensitivity to the stimuli in the world around them, and they're picking up things more. That's why they're more sensitive and easier to insult, or sometimes they're more moody.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, it's probably true. That's a quality that most artists can be defined by.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amazing. Do you have one more you want to share?
Yeah, let me share another one that kind of is related to Chassidus. So we were talking about, how do you incorporate a poem, let's say, that is directly about Chassidus, and without sounding like you're in a soapbox or talking down to the audience. So I think, again, you have to be really interested in the topic yourself and just find it exciting. So you're writing about what's exciting to you, and that hopefully will come across. Or you have to incorporate humor, maybe, that you don't seem like you're taking yourself too seriously.
Right.
And also, I think just juxtaposing things that are very lofty and spiritual with things that are very mundane also will make it more acceptable to write about the lofty. If you're just on this kind of heavenly perch, and that's what you're talking about and where you're talking from, then again you're going to probably be out of touch. Right. So this poem is called Notes on the Tzimtzum. And of course the Tzimtzum is before pre-creation, so to speak. God's infinite light filled all of reality, and in order to create a space for reality to take shape, God had to hide that light or push it to a side. That's called the great Kabbalistic Tzimtzum, or contraction. So this poem is written in sections. A lot of times, more recently, when I do find time to write poems, I also find that they're written in like numbered sections, almost like small pieces or vignettes. And then I just kind of put them together, maybe, and if they'll fit under the same umbrella of an idea. That also is, I write poetry, I said, because it's easier to write one poem at a time as opposed to a novel. But even sometimes that's too much. So you don't have to write a whole poem. You could just, if you're going, and this is what I sometimes do, going through a day, if I see an interesting image or I come up with an interesting line, just like put it down on my phone, and then kind of collect a page of those interesting things, and sometimes they'll fit together. This is a little bit less, disparate things being yoked together, more of, a common theme, but it's called Notes on the Tzimtzum, and it's in numbered sections. 1. Once, on a bus from Jerusalem to En Gedi, I saw a man place his hand over his bare head and recite the blessing over water. 2. One can't use his hand as a head covering, the rabbis conclude, because one can't cover oneself with oneself. 3. Since the divine hand hides that everything stems out of the divine, when God looks at the world like moss growing over moss, he sees only divinity. 4. The Jew without a yarmulke placed the cap on his water bottle and resumed watching a YouTube on black holes. 5. In this world, Hashem conceals his omnipresence, his infinite light, his power to hide, eclipsing his power to reveal. 6. In this world, we ride buses through a divine concealment whose diameter is greater than infinity. We sip water beside a dam that holds back endless light.
Beautiful. Yeah, and you've visualized that. You've given me the ability.
The image,
you're giving
right.
me the ability to visualize it.
Right. I think that's one of the ambitions of a poem. There's a kind of poem called Ars Poetica. Ars Poetica is like a poem that lays out a poetic philosophy. So one of the famous Ars Poetica poems was written by a poet named Archibald MacLeish. It's a great name. And I think he wrote it like in 1927. And he said two interesting lines in the poem. One is a poem should be wordless as the flight of birds. And the other is a poem should not mean but be. And when he says a poem should be wordless as the flight of birds, obviously a poem is made up of words. Poets are called wordsmiths, and
Right.
the primary building block of a poem is words. But you could have words that call attention to themselves, and that's usually an abstraction. Or you could have a word that simply evokes an image in the reader's mind, and then although it's a word, what the reader sees is the image.
Right.
So it's almost wordless. Like if you think about the word stone, for example, you don't notice the word. You might just see a stone in your mind. So he was arguing for poems that use imagery. And he was also saying a poem should not mean but be. He was, although he was being hypocritical when he said that, because he was trying to convey a message, he was trying to mean. But poem should be means a poem should create a kind of an experience that the reader has, not a message that you're trying to convey, but just like the author had this experience, they're kind of trying to get the reader to have that experience as well. Right. And in a poem, probably the most effective way to do that is to use imagery, because it's like chachma. Chachma is like right. the vision, the image, as opposed to the explanation. Right. The meaning, the being versus the meaning experience. Like to stand in a museum and be awed by the beauty of a painting is a chachma experience, a seeing experience. Right. Bina is to read the description on the bottom of why it's a good right. what makes it a good poem. So I think it's similar. Like I mentioned before, you could write an essay about an experience, or you could write a poem. Why would you choose either medium? You're probably going to choose an essay when you want to argue a point and make it convincing, but you might write a poem when you want the reader to experience what you experienced, almost like watching a movie. So it is very reliant on imagery. Right. That's probably also why a poem's able to compress so much in such a short space, because like the cliche that a picture is worth 1,000 words. So when you use an image, right? I had one teacher that said, if you give a character, I mean, this is in fiction, but same idea. If you give a character a brown suit, right, then you already went a long way towards kind of making this character vivid and specific. There's only certain men that would wear brown suits, right? So you already know, this is not, 90% of the population is this character is different than that, right? So it just goes very far. Images do a lot of work. They carry a lot of information. And metaphors are also kinds of images. So, that's really, for me at least, and that's also, I would say, what is the most common refrain you hear in a creative writing class is show, don't tell.
Right.
right? Show, don't tell. It's the same idea. Use an image to convey rather than an abstraction.
Right.
The example I'll sometimes give is I could say my grandfather is eccentric, and that's obviously abstract. You don't picture anything. It's telling. Or I could say my grandfather cuts the elastic rims of his socks because they strangle his legs.
Right.
That's very much showing, and it's very specific and quirky, and then you already kind of have a sense of who he is. That would be probably a being experience where you just take it in, whereas meaning experience you have to climb through the language to get through the meaning. It's also more gratifying for a reader. I often tell my students, what would you rather do? Eat a piece of pizza or read a page of philosophy? Of course, even a philosophy student or a philosopher would rather eat a piece of pizza. Maybe they'll end up reading the philosophy after, but that's just because it appeals to the senses.
Right.
And so when you write with imagery, it also appeals to the senses. They don't have to climb through and do this work. It's kind of instant gratification in the art, which is pleasurable.
Yeah. We're running long. I have two closing questions, but before that, it's occurring to me that you said you invited up to Salem, Massachusetts to present and to be part of that. You're to, I don't know, whatever degree, but you're part of the contemporary literary world. You're recognized to some degree.
To some degree.
And I'm not recognized at all.
I always tell my wife I'm semi-famous.
You're semi-famous. Well, I mean, my question is, what level of responsibility do you feel? Because very few religious artists have made it into the mainstream in whatever field they're in. There's only one other artist that I can. Toby Kahn. Toby Kahn is a visual artist who's made it into contemporary museums and so on. Other than him, really, I mean Chagall is Chagall and one more artist, Yaakov Agam. Other than that, in terms of from people who in the public sphere. So I'm just wondering, do you feel any sense of responsibility, any sense of pressure of sorts to represent otherwise, or it's just you're just going about your business and you'll impact whoever you impact.
I'm definitely aware of that. I think I think it's kind of a balancing act. Like I mentioned before, if you are overtly trying to impart Chassidus, then it won't speak to people. They'll sense that you're trying to superimpose something on them. But why did I choose this life? Partially it has to be that I love poetry and that I'm interested in poetry. But yeah, part of it is that this is a way that I, as an artist, could contribute. I remember asking my my spiritual mentor, should I become a rabbi or a poet?
Right.
And he said that there's going to be certain people that no rabbi would ever be able to reach, and you'll be able to reach them. But again, on the other hand, that might be the reason why part of the reason why you go into what you go into. But in the experience itself, you can't come with an agenda.
Absolutely,
you have to be
just the visuals of you getting
sometimes
up
I forget.
enough.
It's interesting. Sometimes you forget that you look the way that you do, even
right.
Especially because all the students notice. I mean, they're all on their phones.
Right. When they first walk in, the first day of class, they notice.
It was funny. One time I was teaching a class at Rutgers, and the student came in, and then she walked out of the class, and then she came back in. She was like checking her schedule. She's like, "Oh, I left because I thought I was in the wrong class. I thought this was a religion class."
Right. Exactly. Exactly. All right.
Okay,
sure. Thank you
so much. Yeah,
so two closing questions.
Okay.
Number one who are 3 Jewish creatives you think the audience should know?
That's a good question.
In perhaps in your literary
world.
In
my literary world, I'll say some other contemporary poets of faith, religious poets, Jewish poets. There's one who I mentioned a couple times already. David Kaplan is a friend of mine. He's an interesting poet. He has a book called one of his books called Into My Garden, which is taken from the title from Basi Lagani. Okay. and another poet. Her name is Eve Grubin. She's also an Orthodox female poet. She lives in England, but she's from America. She grew up in New York. I would check out her work. Check out my brother's work also.
Okay.
His name is Baruch November, and he has a new book called "The Broken Heart is a Master Key," which is based on a Baal Shem Tov story.
Okay.
So yeah, those are three good poets to check out.
Okay. Thank you. Will do.
Yeah,
And the closing question that we have
yeah,
here
yeah.
is, what's your advice for young creatives for them to find their orange socks?
Orange socks. Yeah, I would say follow the area where your passion lies. I think in my experience, my orange socks are probably in my mind. I don't mean that I'm imagining them. What I mean is that you can be original in your mind and in your actions. Not necessarily doesn't have to be a clothing item per se.
Right.
It could be that just living an original life. Sometimes the outward appearance might be really in conformity to other people or trying to impress other people. So the main thing is to wear your orange socks in your mind,
Yep.
and to be true to yourself, to be original, and to be nonconformist in the most important way, which is to realize, I think, that Judaism doesn't intend for you to be a conformist. Sometimes you go through a system, and there's protocol, and there's regiments, and so on and so forth. But if you could get beneath all of that and find the spirituality that speaks to you, that's really what all the structure is really there for. Don't be discouraged by that structure as much as possible.
Amen. Amen. All right, you sure?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
היום נעשה משהו בלתי נשכח